verification. What John Hick later on was to call eschatological verification. Verification in principle in that way. Okay. But the point is, in all three of these accounts, that there is a much looser use of purportedly factual language. In all three cases, there is language about either a gardener or a stranger or some would-be murderer, you see. In each of these cases, there is factual statement being made that is not capable of passing the logical positivist criterion. And this discussion was widely accepted as the stimulus to ongoing debate. It was representative of the ordinary language view that the positivist criterion is too reductionist, too narrow. There are much broader uses of language, even factual language, than the positivist is able to account for. Now, some of the other views which developed in the following 10 years on through the 50s, in fact, this was the issue in philosophy of religion throughout the 50s until the 60s began to pose other questions. Some of the other views are rather interesting. There was a Cambridge professor by the name of Braithwaite who said that religious language is simply about our moral commitments. I remember hearing him speak one time in which he said that when he goes to church and recites the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, what he's really doing is just committing himself to a certain way of life. Not to the truth of the propositions on which the way of life traditionally has been grounded, but simply committing himself to a certain way of life. Taking, if you like, a Kantian view of religion as being a symbolic expression of moral obligations. Alistair MacIntyre, yes, the same MacIntyre that we now hear of in terms of virtue ethics and so forth, who's now at Notre Dame, Alistair MacIntyre was then a young Scotch-Irish professor, and he tried to maintain that religious language is itself a distinctive language game. That is to say, religious usage are distinctive from all other uses. Cannot be reduced to moral language, cannot be reduced to metaphysical language. He called it idiosyncratic. And so what he was arguing for was an idiosyncratic platitude. And of course, if religious language is idiosyncratic and has no empirical ingredients, then it's not amenable to any kind of empirical evidence. You might be quick to realize that he was coming at that juncture with a Barthian kind of theology, in which natural theology and any kind of rational evidence for the existence of God simply wasn't kosher. And so the idiosyncratic platitude was sufficient. Now, it's in this same context, however, that another individual, Paul Van Buren, who was then, I think, at was it Temple University, published a book called The Secular Meaning of the Gospel. The Secular Meaning of the Gospel, which launched the death of God theology, as it was called in the late 50s, early 60s, the death of God theology. His point was that in a secular age, a secular scientific age, we have to make new sense out of religious language. We have to make new sense out of religious language. God language in its traditional supernaturalist sense, its metaphysical sense, God language is a dead language that has no meaning in a secular scientific age. Why not? Because anything that has factual meaning is amenable to empirical verification. So on the basis of the verifiability principle, he was saying that God is dead. What he meant by that is that God language of a traditional sort is a dead language, has no meaning. And the kind of meaning, therefore, that we make of the gospel is essentially that of some sort of secular humanism. It's a language that veils other commitments and concerns. Well, a whole variety, then, of alternatives were explored, and by the time you get to pretty well the late 50s, logical positivism seems to have crested, be declining, and philosophy of religion is coming back in as completely kosher. Let's see, I met William Alston, who's now one of the leading voices in philosophy of religion in this country. I met him in the late 50s first, when he was an agnostic teaching philosophy of religion at University of Michigan. Now, well, as I say, he's one of the leading figures in philosophy of religion, working on argumentation for the existence of God based on religious experience. One of the other earliest people to take it up was George Mavrodis, who in, I would guess it was the late 50s, early 60s, published a little book called Belief in God, which, again, was able to make this kind of assertion. So the surge in, renewed surge in philosophy of religion began in the late 50s, in the early 60s, and now, as most of you know, has reached perhaps its largest crescendo since then, with work not only in philosophy of religion but in philosophical theology, and nobody thinks of saying that it's meaningless because it's not empirically verifiable. So that introduces us then to the larger diversity of uses that language can have. Now, with that introduction, let me say something about the later Wittgenstein, because in many ways it was his impetus, his work in philosophical investigations, which gave rise to this. This book was published in English in 1953. The first part of it was published in German in 1945. So you can see that this was going on at the same time as the changes that I've mentioned. Now, Wittgenstein sees language as a kind of social behavior. That is to say, language is not simply tied to two functions, cognitive and emotive, the way the positivists have said. But it rather is a social phenomenon that is used in all sorts of different ways. There are various forms that life takes, that human life takes. And language is a tool that is used, it has function, in whatever kind of life form one is involved in. and therefore the diversity of what he calls language games, games you can play. It's an analogy he draws from the fact that you can get, or let's say certain cards, a deck of playing cards, and play many games with the playing cards. So there are all sorts of card games. Well, analogously, you can get English language and do all sorts of things, play all sorts of games with the English language games. Now, let me read a couple of passages which you get both his style and what he's doing. He says, think of the tools in a toolbox. There's a hammer, pliers, a saw, a screwdriver, a rule, a glue pot, glue, nails, screws, and the functions of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects. Okay? So you think of language as a box of tools for doing all sorts of jobs, not just one or two. Or again, a few pages later, how many kinds of sentence are there? Now, he's not saying propositions. A proposition is just one kind of thing. Sentences, language forms. How many kinds of sentences are there? Say, assertion, question, command. Oh, there are countless kinds, different kinds of use. And this multiplicity is not something fixed once and for all, because new types of language, new language games come into existence, and others become obsolete and get forgotten. The term language game is meant to bring into prominence the fact that the speaking of language is part of an activity, a behavior, a form of life. Now, review the multiplicity of language games in the following examples. Giving orders and obeying them. Describing the appearance of an object, giving its measurements. Constructing an object from a description, a drawing. Reporting an event. Speculating about an event. Forming and testing a hypothesis. Presenting the results of an experiment. Making up a story. Reading a story. Acting a play. Singing catches. Guessing riddles. Making a joke. Solving a problem in arithmetic. Translating from one language to another. Asking. Thanking. Cursing. Greeting. Praying. You know, he's quick to say this is just a few. Because here you have different behaviors that involve different uses of language, rather than the reductionist view. And he makes the point that his concern is that we don't confuse different uses of language, and in that way create logical puzzles and problems that are really not problems at all, but just arise from abuses of language. This is the way he puts it. The work of the philosopher consists in assembling reminders for a particular purpose. If you tried to advance philosophical theses, it would never be possible to question them, because they'd have to be about words and everybody would agree. So philosophy does not develop theories of its own. It is still a therapeutic